One of the most interesting things about cancer statistics is the fact that there are different rates of occurrence of different types of cancer in different parts of the world. For example, scientists have known for years that in Asia, in places like Japan, for example, one of the most common types of cancer is stomach cancer. And yet, when you come to a place like the United States, stomach cancer is much lower on the list of occurrence. In the United States, we see much higher rates of breast cancer, lung cancer, and colorectal cancer. In Africa, for many, many years, it's been liver cancer that's been highest on the list. So scientists have asked for a long time why this would be. Why would it be that human beings living in different geographical regions would experience different types of cancer? So scientists asked themselves for many years, is cancer genetic? Are there certain genes that cause cancer that appear in Japanese people differently than they appear in people in the United States or the people in Mexico or the people in Canada? Is cancer genetic? And the answer, of course, is yes and no. It's genetic in the sense that it involves changes to the DNA molecule. Yes, cancers begin with changes to the DNA molecule inside of a cell. But the answer is also no, because cancers are not inherited. If a person develops a cancer in a lung, for example, that person is not going to pass down lung cancer to their offspring. The cancer, if it arises in a somatic cell, and remember, a somatic cell is any cell other than a gamete, other than an egg cell or a sperm cell. If a cancer arises in a somatic cell, that cancer is going to live and die in that one person. It's not going to be passed down to the next generation. Now, it is possible for mutations to be passed down to the next generation if the mutations are found in the gametes. And there are some mutations that make a person more at risk for developing cancers. So while cancers themselves are not inherited, a predisposition to certain cancers can be inherited if the mutation is found in the gamete itself. So the answer to the question, is cancer genetic, is yes and no. Now, going back to this interesting geographical data, scientists did eventually determine that people who are of different geographic origins, genetically speaking, are not susceptible to different cancers because of their genetic makeup. And the reason this was discovered is because we had the chance to follow people who left their country of origin and moved to another place. So by following, for example, people who were born in the United States, who moved to a place like Japan and spent many years in Japan, what was discovered was that those people lost their predisposition to cancers in their country of origin. They lost a predisposition to breast cancer and lung cancer and colorectal cancer, and they gained a predisposition to the cancers of their new country. In other words, you could be born in the United States, but if you moved to Japan and spent years living in Japan, you would take on a predisposition to stomach cancer. Now, we recognize today that that is due to the fact that outside of changes to the DNA molecule itself, cancer is impacted by both lifestyle and environmental exposures. And by lifestyle, I mean, what kind of foods are you eating? Are you getting any exercise? What kind of stress level do you have? Are you sleeping normally? These are the kinds of things that can impact the development of cancer, as can, again, certain environmental exposures. Now, these are what we refer to as epigenetic events, epigenetic changes. And that word epigenetic refers to changes to the DNA molecule, outside of the order of the bases in the genes. When we talk about a mutation, we're talking about a change in the order of the bases in the DNA molecule. But an epi mutation has no effect on the bases themselves. Instead, it affects the expression of that gene. When, if, how, and how much genes are transcribed and translated. Changes in gene expression are considered epigenetic changes or epimutations. And we've now come to understand that they too play a key role in the development of cancer. So in the 21st century, we've learned a lot about the cell biology behind cancer. We know, for example, that cancer is a variety of different diseases. It's not a single disease. It doesn't have a single cause, and it is unlikely that there would ever be a single cure. It's unfortunate because for many years we've talked about curing cancer. And to the general public, that sounds like cancer is one disease and that someday there will be one cure. In reality, that's not true. Now, I have some information on this slide that's highlighted in red, and I have some other information that's highlighted in blue. This information that's highlighted is perhaps the most important information in this lecture. First, mutation and epimutation, one or the other or both, is the starting point of all cancer. Remember, mutation is changes in the sequence of the bases in the gene, and epimutation is changes in the expression of the gene. One or the other or both are at the foundation of all cancers. Now, we ask ourselves, all right, if mutation and epimutation are the starting point, what causes those things? What causes mutation and epimutation? I have 3 things listed: carcinogens, certain infections, and chronic inflammation. Let's move on now to talk about these 3 causes of mutation and epimutation. And we'll begin with carcinogens. Carcinogen is defined as a substance that's capable of causing cancer. And that's because it contributes to, again, either the mutation or the epimutation of DNA. Now, when many of us hear this word carcinogen, we think about chemicals. And yes, there is a long list of known chemical carcinogens. But we have to remember that certain forms of radiation are also carcinogenic. Obviously, ionizing radiation, gamma rays, X-rays, and also less powerful forms of radiation like ultraviolet light. Both of those are also carcinogenic. Let's take a minute and think about chemical carcinogens. As I said a moment ago, there is a long list of chemicals that we now know through scientific study are carcinogenic. There is an even longer list of chemicals that are suspected to be carcinogenic but have not been proven yet in the laboratory. When we look at all of the many chemical carcinogens, we can break them down into different groups. I have the 4 groups listed here. The first type of carcinogen is called a direct carcinogen. This is a chemical that is capable on its own of causing mutations. You've probably heard of some of these. The polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon chemicals, or PAHs, are direct carcinogens. The chemicals called nitrites that are sometimes used to help preserve food. Certain halogenated hydrocarbons, these are all direct carcinogens. They can directly mutate DNA. Next on the list are the pro-carcinogens. This is an interesting group of chemicals. These are chemicals that on their own are not carcinogenic, but once they're brought into the human body and they are metabolized, they are changed so that they can be broken down, they become carcinogens. So they are activated through metabolic reactions. A good example of a procarcinogen is a natural chemical called aflatoxin. This is a toxin that is produced by certain species of fungi. And again, it's not carcinogenic until a human body begins to metabolize it. Next on the list are the indirect carcinogens. These are chemicals that can cause epimutation. Now, the way they do this is typically by interfering with either DNA replication or the process of transcription. Some chemicals also interfere with the repair mechanisms, the mechanisms that fix problems with the DNA molecule. And of course, they cause epimutation, which means they are causing problems with gene expression. A good example of an indirect carcinogen is inorganic metals. These metal compounds are known to interfere with the DNA polymerase enzyme. And of course, that's going to impact the replication process and lead to altered gene expression ultimately. Last on the list are what are called epigenetic carcinogens. Now, epigenetic carcinogens, unlike the indirect carcinogens, are creating cellular changes that lead to damage of the DNA molecule. And it's through damage of the DNA molecule that gene expression is altered. A good example of this is asbestos. You're probably aware of the fact that asbestos fibers, when they're inhaled, can cause a particular type of lung cancer. That type of lung cancer is called mesothelioma. Now, those asbestos fibers are not mutating the DNA in any way. In fact, they're quite inert. They don't stimulate the immune system particularly well. The problem with them is that they are very, very small and they're very sharp. They almost behave like little needles inside of the lung tissue. They poke through the lung tissue and they create damage to the lung tissue, which will then stimulate the immune system and set up a chronic level of inflammatory response. The cellular changes associated with that inflammatory response can then damage DNA inside of the cells in the area of the damage, and that can lead to altered gene expression. So there are direct carcinogens, procarcinogens, indirect carcinogens, and epigenetic carcinogens. I want to spend just a couple minutes talking about cigarettes. We all know that cigarettes have been shown to cause cancer, and we know that cigarette smoke contains hundreds of chemical carcinogens. In the laboratory, we've been able to isolate those carcinogenic chemicals and then expose laboratory animals to them and demonstrate that those laboratory animals developed cancer as a result. Cigarettes and cigarette smoking have a long and interesting history with regards to public health campaigns. I'm sure that at different points in your education, you were taught that cigarette smoking is not good for you. Um, it was as far back as the 1960s that the government started requiring cigarette manufacturers to put warnings on the labels of cigarettes. There was a time when cigarette manufacturers flooded all forms of media with images like this one of the Marlboro Man, trying to convince people that this healthy, active cowboy spent his days smoking Marlboro cigarettes without any problems. Nowadays, we don't allow that kind of advertising. We've got warnings on cigarette packets, and the campaign has been successful in the sense that it has led to a noticeable decline in the number of people who smoke, and also a decline in the cancer associated with cigarette smoking. Um, Lung cancer, of course, is the cancer that most people associate with cigarette smoking, but you should remember that smoking cigarettes can cause other types of cancers as well. The hundreds of chemical carcinogens don't just go into the lungs. They also get into the bloodstream and they expose other tissue types as well. Unfortunately, as smoking levels have decreased in the United States and cancers have decreased in the United States, these companies have only increased their efforts to sell their product in other countries, and those countries have seen an uptick in cancer related to cigarette smoking. Believe it or not, a third of all cancers can be traced back to cigarette smoking. So, approximately 20% of people in the United States report smoking. When you look at New Hampshire, it's around 20% as well. Now, this includes all smoking, so people who report smoking every single day through the day, and people who report smoking periodically. What are sometimes called social smokers, people who will tell you that they only smoke when they're at a party, or they're at a bar, or they're with friends. Unfortunately, about 10% of people 21 years and younger report smoking in our country. That's been a very stubborn number. It's been hard to get below that 9 or 10% level. But again, compared to other countries, the United States is doing fairly well. Cigarette smoking, as I said a moment ago, has been shown to contribute to 1/3 of all cancers and cancer deaths here in the United States and around the world. It's due to the fact that cigarette smoke is full of chemical carcinogens, and smoking causes chronic inflammation inside the lungs. I have a note at the bottom of the slide about vaping. We simply do not know yet whether or not the habit of vaping is capable of causing cancers. But I will say this: bringing any material down into your lungs, any warm, or I should say hot material down into your lungs, is probably not good for your lungs. Your lungs were not designed to inhale a hot vapor or a hot smoke. And it could be that years from now, we'll be looking back at vaping the same way we now look back at cigarette smoking and asking ourselves why people did it. You should understand too that when it comes to smoke, it's nothing magical about tobacco that makes it bad. Anytime you set an organic material on fire and draw that smoke down into your lungs, you're asking for problems. So it doesn't matter if you're smoking tobacco or you're smoking cloves or you're smoking cannabis. If you are setting organic material on fire and inhaling the smoke, you are setting yourself up at least for chronic inflammation. And that, as we now know, can lead to cancers. Tobacco smoking is problematic because smoke is problematic. We've seen, for example, that people who use wood-burning stoves in their home and particularly have older systems in their homes so that some of the smoke is staying in the home, those people are shown to have more chronic lung problems, including lung cancers. We know that places where there's a lot of smoke in the air, in other words, where there's a lot of air pollution, we know that populations show more lung disease and cancers. And finally, studies have shown that firefighters have a higher rate of cancer development. Firefighters who, just by the nature of their work, are often breathing in dangerous levels of smoke just in the course of their work every day.